Andrew, you have argued God from the first cause, the cosmological argument. You have a book on that. The cosmological argument goes way back. Many philosophers have dealt with it. What are some of the original ideas that you bring to the cosmological argument?
Well, one original idea is that I combine different versions of the cosmological argument into one that talks about the beginning of existence. So it is still the Kalam version, but then I use insights from the Thomist tradition and also the Leibnizian tradition to argue for a first cause of time.
Okay, so just describe each of those three traditions and how you bring them together.
Yeah, so the Thomist tradition traditionally argues for a first sustaining cause, and it argues on the basis of dependencies. So for example, we can think of a series of train cars, and each of which are not moving initially. So for the last train car to begin to move, the one before it has to begin to move first. But in order for that to begin to move, the one before it has to begin to move first. Now, if that's the case, then none of them will ever begin to move, right? Because everyone is dependent on the one before it, right? So what is needed is what you call kind of first engine, a first puller, right? That needs to exist first, and in order for the rest to be able to begin to move. And so what this shows is that a dependence regress is a vicious regress, right? So you need to have something that can exist, that is independent, and so that it need to exist. And so this is, so I use this argument from the Thomist tradition to argue for a first cause in the sense that, so for example, before I begin to exist, my parents had to begin to exist first. Now, before they begin to exist, their parents had to begin to exist first. Now, if that's the case, then no matter how many generations there are, none of us will actually begin to exist because everyone is dependent on the one before it. So what is required is that there must be a first independent first cause, which can exist independently and uncaused. So such a first cause must exist in order that in order that other things can begin to exist.
And how does that enhance the Kalam cosmological argument?
Well, it provides another reason for thinking that there is a first cause. So this is one way it enhances it. And the other way it enhances the Kalam argument is that even if the arguments against an infinity of things or traversing actual infinite, even if those arguments fail, we can still prove that there must be a first cause, which starts things going.
Yeah. And how would it fail? How would the Kalam argument fail? Because of the nature of time or infinity?
Well, those have been used as objections to the premises of the Kalam. However, I don't think those objections succeed, actually. I have replied to those objections in my books. So I think that there are actually multiple ways to prove that there is a first cause of time. Okay. But my point here is that even if those fail, right, we can still have this one, right? And so I think the conclusion is unavoidable that there must be a first cause.
Yeah, and the Leibnizian?
Well, the Leibnizian version is a contingency argument, which argues from that things that are dependent would ultimately require something that exists necessarily, and which is independent. And this version is similar to my version in the sense that I also argue from the viciousness of dependence regress. And so this shows that, so I use the insight there to argue that there must be a first cause which can exist independently and also necessarily, right, in that sense. And so so my argument can also be understood as a kind of contingency argument as well. But I use it for the purposes of the Kalam to show that there must be a first cause which is not only uncaused, independent and necessary, but it must also have freedom of will as well in order to bring about the first event. And so my argument actually is superior to the Leibnizian version and also to the Thomist version, because my argument shows that this first cause is something that has free will and therefore is a personal agent.
You know, I have not met a philosopher who thinks that his version is not an improvement over other versions. Not a single one.
Yeah, of course. But then again, you have to look into the details and to see whether the reasonings of those arguments.
So it sounds like each of those arguments have a large overlap, obviously, among them that you bring together. I would think the weakest point of the argument is getting is forcing that first cause to have a will, and I think the way you're arguing it is that it has to have a will because it has to begin the process. Some people would say beginning a process in an in an infinite, whether timeless or infinite, is itself has an element of illogic or difficulty. So how do you begin something? Why, the classic argument, why did it begin when it did? Why did it begin 20 minutes earlier? Or 20 zillion years, if that makes sense, earlier?
Yeah.
I mean, because it did begin, and you're using that to say that there's a will, that there has to be a personhood will behind that, or else you couldn't have started the process. Yeah, but the logic there is that you have a will. Why didn't that will do it at another moment?
Well, to answer this question, first of all, we need to understand the premises of my argument. So the premises of my argument is that there cannot be an infinite regress of dependencies, right? Because it will be a vicious regress. So, and now every event, every change is something that is dependent. And so there cannot be an infinite regress of changes and events, and therefore there must be a first cause which is initially without any events. Which means that at the initial state, there isn't any measurement of time, we'll call it, right? So what is it, 20,000 years or 30,000 years? Because those assume events, those assume change. Whereas what follows from the premise of my argument is that there is a first cause which is initially changeless and without any events, and so there isn't any problem with measurement of time in that sense. And so the next question is, from this initial changeless state, from this initially changeless state, how did such a first cause bring about the first event, right? And so I argue that in order to do that, the first cause must have, firstly, the capacity to originate the first events in such a way that it's not dependent on any prior events, since the first cause is the first. And secondly, the first cause must also have the capacity to prevent itself from changing initially, for otherwise it wouldn't be initially changeless. Now, these two capacities describe what philosophers call libertarian freedom, or in Chinese we can call it 收放自如, right? You can show, 可以放, right? You can refrain, but it can also initiate. And so it's a kind of freedom of will, which is being described here. And so the first cause must have this freedom of will, which means that it's a personal agent, but it's not a natural law or something like that, or it's not something that can be described as a natural law, but it's something that has libertarian freedom to bring about the first event, and therefore it's a personal creator of the universe.